Hi everyone, welcome to Brothers, Sisters, Strangers. I'm Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I am here today with Fern.
Well, Ali John, it's been a while, but I'm so happy to be back with you. And I've had a busy summer. My book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement, and the Road to Reconciliation, has had a lot of exposure through television and articles I've written. And actually, for anybody who's interested in some of the press, I've been posting it on my website under the label Press Highlights.
That's great, Fern. I'm really glad that the book is getting so much attention and is being talked about. It's again such a great book. I find that sheds light on this important subject. And today we're going to be shedding some more light on the whole aspect with regards to sibling estrangement. Because today we're going to be starting the first in a series on the 5 core personality traits. So this is going to be a whole different direction we're taking, because we're going to be expanding through different themes now that will help us to go deeper and delve deeper into understanding why sibling estrangement occurs, especially. So we'll look into the personality aspects. So there's been much talk about personality traits. And the science behind the psychology of personality has evolved in the last 100 years. And while there's some theories that vary from one to the other concerning the number of personality traits today, it's safe to say that the general consensus is that there are 5 core personality traits. And we're going to be focusing on one of those, especially today, on introversion and extroversion. So that's one of the first ones. The other ones being openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which we'll be getting into in further episodes. So I just wanted to say to our viewers, this is going to be a new direction that's going to be exciting for us, and we might not follow all of these sequentially, but we will be getting into some of these themes and topics as we move along forward together.
So there are 5 personality traits, and I think I differ from my brother on all 5. So that creates a real challenge in terms of establishing and sustaining a relationship, and of course in reconciling the relationship as well. And I think it's important to recognize that people in general have different ways of connecting. Some, as you say, are introverts or extroverts. Some have more emotional intelligence than others. The genders are different. And so we have to be careful how we generalize. On the other hand, I can say from my own experience that all of these things made it really challenging to connect with my own brother.
It's so important that we address this, because again, I mean, there's lots of misunderstandings that can arise and that can, expand and become further problems down the road if people aren't aware of some of these traits and how they play themselves out. So I think that that's really important what you're saying, and I think that this is a conversation to be had. And I mean, introversion and extroversion has been largely around for the last 100 years or so. I know that Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, talked about this in 1923, where he got into expanding on the definitions of what those were. Largely extroverts, they like to engage with the outside world of objects, sensory perception, and action. And introverts are described as being more focused on the internal world of reflection, are thoughtful and insightful. And a lot of times, I think that Jung didn't explore the whole notion of sociability or assertiveness that is being now explored nowadays in terms of what's associated to these traits. But that's very important, how they express themselves. So that is a bit of the weakness in Jung's approach initially, but we've since grown much more since then with regards to identifying how these traits are expressed.
That's interesting. I don't think how can you describe the changes since Jung?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think that a lot of times these types of traits can have different ways of expressing themselves. So we know that introverts will have more of an appreciation for spending time alone. They'll have a tendency to go inside of themselves, listen more, and talk less in general. engage in social activities, but also just to take a step back when they feel overwhelmed, and maybe even shy away from the spotlight. Extroverts will have a tendency to talk more about their thoughts and feelings. They like to resolve problems through communication and talking. They'll tend to act first before thinking, and they will not deal well with excessive time spent alone. We just need to think about the pandemic, for example, in terms of that's done to a number of people. And being outwardly directed for ideas and inspirations, as well as perhaps being more approachable in the sense that if you start talking with them, well, they'll talk with you. So.
Well, let me ask you this. Can you have some of both of those characteristics? Because I'm looking at your list and I'm thinking, well, I do tend to listen more, talk less at times, but at the same time, I do like to communicate and talk about feelings. So can you pick and choose from these lists?
Absolutely. It is a spectrum, mind you, and I know that myself, I'm probably close to half and half in that way. So it's good. I like my alone time, but I'm okay with talking publicly and speaking, as we well know. So there's that. So yes, you can be on the spectrum in different ways. It doesn't mean you're in one of the more extreme categories necessarily, But
I think it's really hard when you have a sibling who tends to be extremely introverted and very reluctant to talk about their feelings, and you have a desire to address some of the feelings that you have. So for example, in my case with my brother, I really needed to know why he didn't want to sustain a relationship. He might have been just as happy to reconnect and leave it all behind us. But in the end, I couldn't live with that. And we ended up going to a therapist to try to sort this out.
Exactly. And what you illustrate is very important because I think that, like you say, introverts and extroverts will deal with problems differently. And we'll get into some of the healthy and unhealthy expressions as we move along through that. But I do want to talk a little bit about the science of why that is. And in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences Journal, there is an article that mentions that extroverts will respond more towards outer rewards because there's an implied stimuli because of their already sensitive dopamine system. So external validation becomes important for extroverts because that's how they relate to the world. And in the American Journal of Psychiatry, an article states, for example, with introverts that they have more blood flow to the frontal lobes and the frontal thalamus, which foster problem solving and planning. So that might explain why introverts have a tendency to go inside of themselves when faced with a difficult situation, namely a difficult sibling relationship. And you start to understand that it's a protective mechanism that can foster a shutting down of oneself, which can inhibit communication when people experience difficult matters. So that's something to look out for when it comes to introversion and introverted people.
Well, I certainly have that with my brother, and it's very difficult to find a comfortable zone in which you can connect. And then there's the added difficulty for me that he's male, because I'm dealing with what I would say is the dark side of the moon. I don't fully understand the way men think, and then I'm trying to reconcile this relationship with somebody who's very different in terms of introversion and extroversion. So it's especially challenging. I think if I had been estranged from a sister, maybe I'd have a stronger sense of comfort in all this, because I know the territory.
Yeah, and you're right. I think that there is a certain sense of familiarity with gender. I think that can play sometimes into that and certain identification and such, whereas you're having to think of different elements also when it comes to identifying with people of the opposite sex and such. But there are healthy and unhealthy expressions with regards to introversion and extroversion. And I think that's important that we kind of identify some of that just to help our viewers know what to look out for. Because if we're on the receiving end of a difficult sibling, it can be that they'll tend to go inside of themselves, trying to figure out what to do, or just to go deeper as a means to asepticize themselves from the difficult outer world. Now, it might be them or it might be us. in that way. And there's nothing wrong with going in and trying to figure out just what's the best way to handle a difficult sibling relationship. But if it's done too much, what can happen is we can fall into an unhealthy expression of introversion, and that can be used as a means of escape rather than to deal with the external situation. So that's introverts in general. Extroverts, in terms of the way they express themselves, is that it may be difficult for them to interact with an introverted sibling in that the latter may not be clear about what is bothering them, given that they go inside of themselves more, which the extrovert is going to want to talk about the issue and foster an externalizing of the issue, but that can cause the introvert to go back further inside of themselves, you know, so it's like kind of the cat and mouse game when you think about it in some ways. And
You know, you remind me, there's a really funny story in my book. My brother and I take a bike ride, and we end up talking pretty deeply about a series of important issues. And we sit on a bench and chat for a while. And I turn to him and I say, "You're so different." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because you actually talk about your feelings." And he said, "Yeah, I guess I am different. And I like that we're talking about these things." And I said, "Well, that's great. You know, that's why people do it, because it's engaging and it's fulfilling." And, you know, it's kind of this moment where his whole view shifted.
you know, you probably created a good environment to promote that in that way because you were able to bring him out of himself more so, so that way he could engage and he felt safe in doing that. So his natural defense mechanism, you know, didn't get activated, so he could be and feel safe with you, and you fostered that also for yourself, given that you needed to have that talk, that external validation with him in that way. So you can see how you were able to do that, which I think is great, actually. Because forcing a conversation is not really the best either, because when you're forcing a conversation, people will revert back to themselves, back to their traits.
You know, there's this whole debate in reconciliation as to whether or not you have to talk about the things that divided you. And there are a lot of people who feel like, hey, just cut it off and leave it behind us. There are others like me who I was so fearful that I was going to lapse back into estrangement that I needed to have some information as to what produced the divide. You know, people are all different, but in my case, I felt I needed to know. And that's what drove me to have those serious conversations with him.
Absolutely, and I mean, you did what you thought was needed in that way, and you obviously created a good medium to be able to promote that, and that did a lot for you because that reassured you in that sense. Once you cleared the air, so to speak, by having that talk, it really reassured you. So that was what gave you that sense of validation, and he probably felt safe in doing so with you. So that way, that gave him food for thought that he could perhaps dwell on later on and maybe think of in his own way in his own time, that would enable him to perhaps restructure what is going on within himself and how he perceives life and the sibling relationship in general.
I absolutely agree with you. I've seen pretty deep changes in him, and I'm pretty sure it started with our reconciliation. He's much more able to reflect and to discuss issues that are difficult for him. And he's taken that into other relationships in his life, with his children, for example. And I'm happy for him, because living that life where you're so closed down and so afraid of conversation is not healthy.
No, and that's the thing. So, I mean, I hope that our viewers will understand more about how this particular trait affects us in different ways and may affect different people also. So again, this trait will play itself out, and it's important to realize that there's many factors at play in a sibling relationship, and this may be one of them that again plays into this. And there is something I've been wanting to mention, because as I've been studying this and putting all of this together, I've kind of discovered or had my own sense of questions that popped up. And maybe we can have our viewers explore some of this on their own, because I think that I'd love to hear what our viewers have to say about this. And I'd like for us to kind of think about if alienation is the main issue of contention for extroverts, because when extroverts aren't allowed to do what they do best, which is to talk, and try to resolve problems through interaction, I wonder sometimes if alienation is something that weighs more heavily on extroverts. And I also wonder in some ways if rumination might not be the issue that bothers introverts the most. Simply because they go inside of themselves, they try to resolve an issue, they're not quite able to come to a viable conclusion, and they may replay the scene over and over again in their heads if they have a sibling that doesn't engage with them anymore. So I wonder if that's not the case with introverts, that they might ruminate more. So I want to leave these questions open. I'd love to hear back from our viewers about this, because it's so fascinating, all of this and how this all applies to us.
Well, I'll start by saying I fall into both those categories. So, somehow I'm both the introvert and the extrovert. I'd love to see the comments. And I think we're about out of time, but I look forward to the others in this series. So thank you so much for bringing my attention to this. I hadn't really fully thought about it.
Well, thank you for being part of this, Fern. It's always good to have you here, and of course to bring your perspective and your feedback on this and how this applies to our sibling relationships. And myself also, I'm seeing how this applies to my own sibling relationship too, and how it's affecting it. So I look forward to doing this again with you. I hope that you'll be around for all of the other episodes we'll be doing with regards to this particular series, and other series that we will be getting into, of course, as we move along. So thanks for being here.
Great to be with you.
All right, you take care, Fern.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.